And with that, I am very happy to be able to introduce our keynote speaker. Dr. Amar Christian is an associate professor of communication studies at Northwestern University. His research focuses on the political economy of legacy and new media, cultural studies, and community-based research. He published his first book, Open TV, Innovation Beyond Hollywood and the Rise of Web Television, on New York University Press in 2018, and is currently writing his second book, Open Systems, which explores how to repair systemic harm and discrimination in media, technology, and research. His scholarship has been published in numerous academic journals, including the International Journal of Communication, Television and New Media, Social Media and Society, Journal of Cinema and Media Studies, among other journals and edited collections. Dr. Christian engages industry and community-based organizations as part of his research. He's given lectures for and collaborated with the Sundance Institute, Vimeo, the SAG-AFTRA Foundation, Black Public Media, and more. He has juried television and video for the Peabody Awards, Gotham Awards, and the Tribeca Film Festival, among others. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Christian. I'm going to hand things over to you.
Thank you so much, Samvera, Heather, and Carolyn for inviting me. I am really honored to be here. I'm really honored that you are here on Zoom listening to me talk. A lot of us have been on Zoom for now well over a year, for hours and hours a day. It's very hard to get me to show up to a Zoom conference. So the fact that there are 60 people in this room is wonderful, and it really makes me excited. Today, I'm going to talk about something that's really new to me. This is not a lecture I've given before. This is completely new, and I'm calling it Digital Archiving in Process as a Reparative Practice. My next book is looking at reparative practice in media, technology, and research using the case study of OTV that I'll be doing today. And that case study is really speaking to those fields or industries, media, mostly via Hollywood and television, technology, mostly via social media companies, and research itself through universities. Today, I'll be talking about something that's a little bit aside of the project, but is maybe the next phase or one of the next phases. There's multiple next phases to this project. But I did want to start by just saying that, I'm not an archivist by training. I don't have training in library science or information studies. I do read information studies and read about archiving as part of my broader reading, but this is not my expert area. I'm rather someone who found themselves archiving without necessarily recognizing that that's what I was doing. And the management of information has, the more I've done the work, increasingly become kind of a pressing issue that I've realized I need to start fundraising for. So it was just last year that I started writing for my first grants for digital archiving. So this is very much a new area for me. I found myself initially confronted with the challenges of digital archiving during the early years of research for my book. My book is on what some people call web series, what I call independent television. These are television series that are produced and distributed independent of the Hollywood system via the internet, because the internet is an open distribution platform and allows producers to distribute their TV shows without having to go to ABC, HBO, or Netflix eventually to distribute their shows. When I was trying to figure out what the historical context was for this, because I started studying this in the mid-2000s, right around the time that YouTube became available to the general public and streaming started to become a thing, a popular activity. I realized going through LexisNexis, going through trade publications, that there were versions of web series that had dated back to the 1990s. And in fact, the first web series had sold to NBC in 1996, a series called The Spot, which you see pictured on the left of this, these screen captures from the Internet Archive or the Wayback Machine. I realized doing my research that The Spot wasn't the only show. There were actually dozens of kind of independent television shows that were mostly text and photo based with minimal video, because this was dial-up, obviously, and video was very hard to download. And I noticed that there were tons of holes and gaps in the archive, right? We can see here on the upper left, there's an image from the spot, which is just not visible. And while I was able to get some decent screenshots, as you can see here, of the spot over here and of this series, Gay Days over here, these were pretty rare. I mean, if I look in my folder, there's really not much I was able to actually pull. Most of these series, because they were independent, because they were small scale, they weren't working with corporations that were consistently storing their data. There's a lot of this history that is lost, even though digital technologies can hold lots of information. That information has to be carefully processed, right? And so this was the beginning of my understanding that digital technology, digital archiving, is not any better necessarily, right, than physical archiving. And so I will come to how I'm thinking about this in a much more robust way, but I do want to talk a little bit about the kinds of people I'm now working with. So through my current community-based work, I work with so-called intersectional artists or communities. These are artists who come from multiple communities that have been historically marginalized across fields and contexts, right? Intersectionality is a Black feminist theory designed to describe how Black women live at the intersection of race and gender and face a specific form of marginalization because of the ways in which those two identity categories manifest, right? They face racism and sexism, and then a unique form of racism and sexism, which Moy Bailey, who just joined us in comm studies, calls misogynoir. We see this kind of form of marginalization in archives themselves. These kinds of slippages and invisibilities in archives is not unfamiliar to people in my communities. I was really inspired by the author C. Riley Norton, who in his book, Black on Both Sides, tries to write a racial history of trans identity, understanding that trans people, the term trans is relatively modern and so doesn't necessarily exist throughout history. And also because of gender marginalization, trans people have been marginalized in archives in a range of ways. KJ Rawson, in the inaugural issue of Transgender Studies Quarterly, writes, transgender phenomenon proved quite challenging to the archive. The very site of transgender experience, the body, cannot be captured by historical fragments collected in an archive because of the irreducible distance between historical objects and the lives they come to represent. As a result of archival memory's separation from the, quote, source of knowledge, from the knower, the archive fails to capture much embodied and ephemeral memory. And indeed, that is what I have found is the possibility of what I'm calling archiving in practice, which I will talk, is that possibility to capture embodied and ephemeral memory, which are essential to identities that are complex, right, and that are not historically represented. I must say that Riley finds some possibility in these slippages, and notes that race too ruptures archives in addition to trans identity. Riley, drawing from Tavi Nwango, says that race is a theory of history and counters that race is a history of theory that functions to express what is thinkable or unthinkable across complex temporalities. He writes, in each formulation, history becomes less a program for examining change over time and more an examination of disruptions in linear time, right? Riley here finds possibility in disruption. Drawing from L.H. Stallings, he writes, Stallings writes, if transgender and transsexual history and culture depend on what has been published, visible, legible, and authorized enough to be archived, then we might query what has been omitted as a result of the conditions of illiteracy, criminalization, and poverty, right? In this book, Riley finds trans history in criminal records, right, in legal records, which is a kind of now common practice within queer archiving and queer history. Stourton instead embarks on a, quote, combination of foraging and disfiguration with an attentiveness to interstitial spaces in the archives to continue an ongoing investigation of racialized gender. He asks, what can image reveal about the histories of Blackness, transness, and sexual cultures, about their indefinities and irreducibilities, about their temporalities, of emergence. I might add for this talk, what might it mean to find answers to these questions not in interstitial spaces, but in the abundance that digital art technologies afford? And I think that I'm not the only one thinking about this. I think there's a lot of scholars and independent archivists who believe that the digital might be able to actually fill in those interstitial pieces such that we can actually discover these histories, remember these histories in some of the fullness in which they were actually lived. I'm pointing to my colleague at Temple, Adrian Shaw's LGBTQ plus video game archive and the digital transgender archive as just two instances of looking back to history and using the digital to start collecting some of that richness in information. Of course, digital archiving has its own inefficiencies and its flexibility, presents an opportunity to queer the archive. Trevor Owens, writing about digital preservation generally, says that digital preservation is a craft, not a science. The history of computing is best primarily understood as a social and cultural phenomenon instead of a technical one. Rhetorically, computing is sold to us as clean, efficient, and nearly perfect logical mechanisms. However, experience teaches us that computers are very much a part of the misses we know so well from our analog world. It drives fail, right? Bits flip, files corrupt, as I showed earlier. Craft is essential here because it is an ongoing unresolved dialogue between preservation professions and, quote, must be responsive to the inherent messiness and historically contingent nature of the logics of computing, right? So we see here that both digital archiving could potentially expand who can do archiving, and that data has a social life. I'm drawing there from David Beer and Roger Burrows, and that this social life is integral to the process of digital archiving to attend to those bits flipping, files corrupting, right? The uncleanliness of this digital form of archiving. So what's missing in the messiness and contingent nature of this social life, I would argue, is intersectionality. And so a focus on intersectionality with digital archiving presents a really unique opportunity to explore the possibilities of this craft, as Owen says. He writes, there are no, quote, universal solutions, which is a tenet of intersectionality, rather crafting the right approach for a given preservation context, right? The need for specificity, the need for attending to the social complexities, right, of the work that you are contending with. So where do I enter in on this terrain of the unequal archive on one end and the slippages of digital archives on the other? This became apparent to me that I was archiving and that maybe I wasn't thinking about it as robustly when I had a meeting with Jacqueline Stewart, who is now, I believe, the artistic director of the Museum for the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, known for the Oscars, a professor at the University of Chicago, and recent MacArthur Genius Grant winner, I believe. We had coffee and she told me that when I was describing my process of working with artists to make intersectional video here in Chicago and distribute it, she told me I was archiving. And she asked me about my process, and I was, unfortunately, I didn't have great answers, and I felt very called out by that question, because I realized that there was historical significance to what I was doing when I was hyper-focused at the time, this was a couple of years ago, on the present. Jacqueline Stewart is very aware of the archive. She studies historical cinema. Her book, a number of her books are on the history of Black independent cinema, which tends to be quite fractured. And she is one of the founders of the Southside Home Movies Project here in Chicago, where she archives home movies from the South Side of Chicago, understanding that the everyday people's representations of their neighborhoods also matter. And of course, she's from the South Side, so she has a personal investment in this. I noticed through Jackie Stewart that I was performing an archive through my work at OTV. And I was realizing the power of understanding history and the contemporary reality of inequality and marginalization, and the importance of archiving that while my participants were alive to assist in that process. And that notion of them being alive is very pressing because we have lost artists even though most of them are very young already in the 5 years that we have been doing this work. I also noticed the power in understanding the everyday lives of marginalized people as it relates to the sensationalized representations we see of us on TV. We're in a moment right now where Hollywood is newly discovering the power of intersectionality. We have Pose, the first show starring Black trans people. We have Random Acts of Flyness on HBO, an experimental show about the multiplicity of the Black experience. We have Hentified and a number of other shows foregrounding working class Latinx communities. Vida, right, which is a queer Latinx show on Stars, beautiful show. P-Valley. There's all these stories that have never been told, and they're wonderful, but they're also still corporatized, right? They're made for marketing. And the stories that I release, you will see the stories that I've cultivated here in collaboration with artists in Chicago are much more down home. There's simply not the budget to create that kind of razzmatazz. And so you end up getting snapshots of what life is like in this present time for people whose lives, whose everyday lives are considered kind of too boring, right, for Hollywood. So I'm wondering, the question I'm going to be posing throughout this talk is, can this process repair the slippages in future archives? Are we actually in OTV correcting some of the archival problems that the future generations might have? That's a very open question. I really don't know. History tells me to be highly skeptical. But I also remain temperamentally hopeful. So, this is just a snapshot of what I'm talking about, which is a platform called OTV, Open Television. We're a platform for intersectional television, and we assist artists who have been historically marginalized by their race, gender, sexuality, disability, religion, citizenship status, and other forms of identity marginalization in telling their stories. Practically, this looks like a reciprocal relationship between researcher and subject, where in order to start the research process, I first ask an artist, what is the story they want to tell and why? And then I offer advice as to how they might begin the process of developing and producing that story based on my research and over the years, based on the real life connections I've made to other people in this city who want to help make this work reimagined. We then, once the stories are fundraised for and produced, which is a whole process, which I'll touch on a little bit in this talk, and the work is made, we then release it on the OTV distribution app, which is available on most connected TV devices and mobile devices. And then after the story is released, I meet with the artists again and I ask them, how was that process for you? What did you learn? What kinds of innovations did you discover? What kinds of conflicts and harms did you encounter, and how was OTV supportive or not in that process? That's a way to keep the platform accountable to the communities that we represent, knowing that there is a legacy of exploitation and research of these communities, but also a way to share knowledge, right? To find out, what did they learn, and can I relay that knowledge to other artists so that they can do the process better and that we can continually build capacity within our own communities. I think if you look at this trailer, right, it looks a little like Hollywood, right? These artists do a really good job on literally almost zero resources. And some of these shows have sold to HBO and Netflix. Other of them have trended, very widely on YouTube and other social media platforms. But this is not commercial television, right? This is inviting audiences in, and this is activating the archive in a new way. For me, I found myself funding and developing cultural production to preserve a sense of life now, with the understanding that Hollywood is not real life, and this indie grassroots world is closer to the lives of these people that you see here. I could not talk about this without first foregrounding the value and challenges of video. I've talked a lot about video and the ways in which it can show the richness of experience at a given time, and that is definitely true. The problem with video is that it is data intensive, right? Here you see a headline, which we've seen throughout the 2010s, that Netflix alone accounts for significant percentages of downstream internet traffic. Going back to closer to 2012, when they started streaming, there were certain nights where Netflix was accounting for anywhere from 30 to 40% of all internet traffic in the United States, one website alone. And video accounts for the majority of internet traffic. There is an abundance of video online, right? So what I'm talking about with OTV, we've released, well over 100 hours of video, but when you look at YouTube, well over 100 hours of video is uploaded to YouTube every single minute. Estimates have it as much as 500 hours of video are uploaded to YouTube every minute. And that's just YouTube. Most platforms have video. YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, all have video platforms. Of course, we have the possibility of capturing the nuances of historically marginalized experiences, but how much of it can we actually store is a huge question, right? Most of this probably will be lost to history in some shape. And yet video is not the only artifact developed from what I would call this digital archiving in process. So this process of making video creators robust archives and artifacts due to the complex interdisciplinary multimodal nature of video practice presents unique opportunity for communities whose lives have been abridged in traditional archives. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the process that we work with artists and show how at each stage there are unique and quite different archival possibilities that are quite unexpected. Not everything I'm going to show you I am actively archiving. In fact, I'm using this talk to sort of put down stakes in the road to remind myself when I get the resources to start preserving some of these artifacts. So every process starts with the development, which is the conception of the story, moves to production. When the thing is produced, it is distributed. That goes to audiences through exhibition platforms like the internet, like apps. And then for me as a researcher, I look back at that entire process and understand the possibilities and challenges at each stage. When we talk about development, we talk about the conceptualization of the story. And we can think about the script, right, as the first artifact. The script is often printed. It is often a physical artifact because it is needed on set to guide production, right? And people don't typically want to have more screens that they have to charge on set in order to figure out what they have to do next. And multiple people need copies of things. So you don't really have the situation where you have like 50 iPads because every crew member might need to know what's happening next, right? The prop master needs to know, the DP, the director, the actor, et cetera. We haven't been preserving scripts, right? But scripts often have notes that are written in production, which feature changes or ideas that people have. And that goes to how these worlds, right, are being created. But there's other developmental spaces in this project, in this process. We've done more work to help artists, even before they write, figure out how do I write. This is a photograph from an event that we did at the studio for the Wachowskis. Lily Wachowski is a pretty big supporter of the platform. She's the director of The Matrix, amongst many other well-known films. And she, in her late stage of her career, has viewed her legacy as enabling other people to kind of have the success that she has had. So at her studio, in partnership with the Sundance Institute, we hosted something called Emerging Storytellers of Chicago. And we gathered 12 to 30 of our artists to work with representatives from Sundance and filmmakers who had had films at Sundance to help them figure out, how do I talk about my story? I have this idea for a story. How do I get people invested in it? How do I talk to executives? How do I talk to funders? How do I talk to other creatives about why this story matters? Before we even started on the collective work of helping them create their stories, our head of community at the time, Jenna Annis, created these things called Brave Space Agreements, which is very much like the agreements that you had before this talk, right? It's the kind of, what are the values that we bring to this space? She wrote them down on this little mirror with beautiful font. I don't know how she did this. She has incredible writing. And it was a way, because our artists are often talking about very vulnerable stories. Many of our artists write about traumas that they have experienced or harms that they have experienced. That can get very sensitive, right? And we want them to feel safe and brave being vulnerable, because that is essential to quality storytelling. And so these Brave Space Agreements are meant to set that scene. And again, I hadn't thought about this as a artifact, as a non-digital artifact that is part of our digital process. But I wish I had saved this little mirror. I love how she wrote it on a mirror, because anyone who looks at it can see themselves in these Brave Space Agreements, right? And it's just a way in which we have these agreements online. We've created a video recording of these race-based agreements, right? So it's not about preserving the words themselves, right? But it's about preserving this instantiation of it because it was so unique to this space where, because we were curating a space with Sundance, an institution that has historically excluded our communities, we didn't want artists to feel nervous in this space, right? We wanted them to see themselves as brave agents of their stories. Of course, production is a resource-intensive environment that creates lots of opportunity for digital archiving. Of course, I think that when Jacqueline Stewart proposed the idea that I was archiving, I think she was thinking primarily of the shows themselves, right? Which are beautiful. And I think, she had been looking at celluloid archives and 8mm film, Super 8 film, and thinking about how hard it was for her to access those archives, digitize them, which she has. There's DVDs of some of the independent films that she's studied. And she was thinking that, we don't want to lose these shows to history because these shows are not archived by large corporate institutions that have, vast amounts of server space for all their intellectual property. However, I also think about the production spaces, right? Production spaces have tons of really unique artifacts from costumes, from props, to even the makeup that the actors are using. Each of those can be highly, highly culturally specific, reflective of the fashion and styles of these times, of the values of these communities in this particular milieu that we are discussing. I should note, just as an aside, we think about production in a really robust way. And because we are small scale and working outside of mainstream institutions, including unions, which have their own histories of discrimination, the people behind the camera for OTV oftentimes reflect the people in front of the camera, which is super rare in Hollywood. And I think that creates much more compelling storytelling for our different productions. That has been noted in two of our most popular shows, Brown Girls, which explores the friendship between a Black woman and a queer Muslim woman, and Code Switch, which is a friendship comedy of different kinds of South Asian folks living in Chicago. Both of these shows, despite having incredibly low budgets, have built sizable audiences and have sold to major Hollywood corporations. I think because there's a richness to the acting that you can get when actors are looking at people who look like them behind the camera. And I think that, for me, forms a theoretical justification for archiving these particular productions. Because when you look at your pose on TV, I guarantee you behind the camera does not look like in front of the camera for those corporate shows. So we are a distribution platform. That's our little app logo, and you can find us on all your devices. For me, this independent distribution platform is a living archive, right? All of our productions live on this app. This is where they're accessible. We work with Vimeo to publish this app. Vimeo makes it really easy to start your own TV app. So we work with a corporation that is part of a broader conglomeration, IAC, that archives our video right now and stores it. Of course, as I mentioned, there's lots of video, and this is a very expensive form of archiving. So we're really happy to have that corporate support. But I think all the time, what does it mean to be working with a corporation, right, on our distribution, and how sustainable is Vimeo as a corporation, right? So doing this process, I am following Vimeo's corporate history and wondering, like, how healthy are they? If their stock takes a tumble, do I need to start thinking about backups, right, for this video? Of course, I do have backups, which I will talk about later. And Vimeo is actually doing a really healthy business because in the pandemic, everyone wanted to start an app. So they have actually spinning off of their corporate overlord because the corporation thinks like they can just sell the company because they're making so much money. They've hired like 100 people in the last year. Rounding out, we think about exhibition really robustly at OTV. Exhibition for us is both live and digital. And exhibition occurs in a range of spaces, both live and digitally. Our digital spaces of exhibition have shifted. Our app is relatively new. We launched that in 2020. Before that, we we're on Vimeo's open upload platform, which is free to use for the public for the most part. And we also publish on social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Tumblr, etc. Publishing original video, publishing photos, publishing GIFs, blogs, original writing, sometimes even audio. So we show up in different digital spaces, even including our own website, right, where we have a lot of those artifacts also published, a website that isn't run on Vimeo. In terms of exhibition live, though, I love how digital video travels very seamlessly throughout spaces. We have shown in the biggest theaters in Chicago. We've shown many times at the Chicago Cultural Center through a residency at DCASE. We've shown many times at the Museum of Contemporary Art here. We've shown at the Art Institute of Chicago, the National Museum of Mexican Art, but we've also shown video in homes. So right here, you see pictured an intimate event that we hosted at the home of Dr. E. Patrick Johnson, who is now the Dean of the School of Communication at Northwestern University. He has a beautiful home that he has built for bringing in community for various kinds of events. He's kind of one of the most notorious and well-known hosts in Chicago, and very much when he was living in Bronzeville, he now lives in Evanston because Dean life is real, right? But when he was living in Bronzeville for 20 years, he was very much an anchor of the community as kind of the Black queer mother, if you will, of the Bronzeville neighborhood. And so it was an honor to have events at his home. This was a fundraiser for the project itself. At the time, Dr. Johnson was on our board, which he's no longer because of conflict of interest, because he's my boss. But we were fundraising for the platform and for one of my projects. And we always like to bring in different art forms into our exhibition spaces. So we don't ever want to just show video if we can manage it. Sometimes the venues are too big and we have too much screen. But here we worked with a number of different artists, including 2 musical artists. One pictured here, Alexa Gray, was classically trained as an opera singer at Northwestern, is a Black non-binary artist, countertenor, an incredible singer who had done a number of video art projects, including one that is on OTV called Sur la Nuit, which is a kind of poem and operatic / R&B kind of video art experience, which is stunning. You have to watch it. So here they are singing an excerpt from that piece. So it's something where you can go on the platform and watch the video, but now you have this embodied experience, right? I think here about Diana Taylor's archive and repertoire, this notion that multiple communities across America perform the archive through their body, right? The archive actually exists in the transmutations across generations of different art forms through communities that preserve their histories through oral and embodied practices when physical archives might fail them. And we have photo of this performance. We don't have video of this performance. This is something where it's ephemeral. You had to have been there, right? But I do think about preserving the photo. We do video some of these exhibitions, less so than we used to in the early years, where we used to have a lot of these intimate, artisanally crafted screenings. This one is at a bar in Wrigleyville, right next to one of the most iconic queer bars in Chicago called Smart Bar. This is the premiere of a short film from a drag artist named Shea Coulee, who some of you may know as the winner of RuPaul's Drag Race All-Stars Season 5. This was before she even went on Drag Race. She created this beautiful short film that is very much an ode to Chicago's queer community and a fashion film, an ode to her ability to make clothes, because part of her drag is that she, at the time, made a lot of her own costumes. She has a BA in costume design. So here's Shea Coulee talking about this exhibition, which I think was really important to her because she is a host of a regular night at that bar and at the bar next door, Smart Bar. And so she was able to show her community in a space where she regularly exists, that she's not just this live drag artist that lip syncs to pop songs, which she does very well, and is a complex art form in and of itself, but she is now also this filmmaker, right? And so I really love this video. I really love that we are able to capture this moment in history in video. I really think several decades from now, we will be looking at Shea Coulee on the level of RuPaul as one of the iconic drag queens in American history. And here is a moment that, most people in her fan base, the millions of fans that she now has no idea happened, right? But everyone in Chicago, which is where she birthed her artistry, knows about this moment, this very important pivotal moment in her career, because the following year, right after this, she was on RuPaul's Drag Race. I think it was season 9. Now let's talk about exhibition online. Where do these productions show up? Where can our community find them online? How do we exhibit them online? Social media is an interesting place to think about archiving. It's variously difficult or not to archive various kinds of social media posts. In Instagram, which is our best social media platform, it's where we have the most active audience. Every user has the ability to archive their posts. It's only available on mobile, which I think is really interesting. You can't get this in the browser app. In preparing for this talk, I was reminded that a lot of the digital artifacts that we have created through OTV have actually been through my own personal social media, because I was running this project under my Northwestern research program as an experiment. I posted a lot about this project. And I wanted to save all of those postings, because even in the comments and the likes, there's interesting nuance and context as to how were we exhibiting on social media? What were people getting from when we showed up online? So what you see here are snapshots of my own personal Instagram archive. And each one of these posts is a unique story, from, press that covered us. This is when we did an exhibition in Berlin, which was only these actually couple posts right here are from our Berlin. We showed in a gallery in Berlin. Only a couple people showed up to this little screening of OTV, because obviously OTV isn't based in Berlin. We didn't have a big audience in Berlin. I think it was about a dozen people. I worked with this at the time PhD student Karina Griffith, who was studying Black filmmakers in Germany, and she wanted to refract that conversation with Black filmmakers in the United States. And that was a beautiful experience where we have photo of that. I think there's actually also an audio recording of the conversation we had after screening our work in Berlin, which I think will be interesting if anyone is archivally interested in OTV. This is our screening at the Art Institute right here, our screening at the Chicago International Film Festival. I produced a pilot and directed a pilot of my very own in collaboration with a really experimental writer's room, and I had a reading in my house, and this is a photo of that reading in my house. This is a music video that I appeared in as an extra from one of the artists whose music video collection we have on OTV. I mean, there's just, every one of these is just a unique way in which this digital experiment manifested across the world in these physical contexts and in these digital contexts. Finally, really briefly, before I wrap, of course, I'm a researcher and I take research very seriously. And I think about my research as a form of building this archive, from the interviews that I do with artists about their production process in this article in which I re-theorize production value through this process, to this study of how one of our most popular shows, two of our most popular shows, Brown Girls and Brujos, manifested both online and in cities around the world. Both of these shows did screenings outside of Chicago. They artisanally crafted these screenings in collaboration with universities, community groups, activist groups. Poets were like huge drivers of these screenings. Each screening was a unique experience. For this article, I interviewed people who screened this in their communities and asked, why was this screening important to you, this little digital show? What did it allow you to do in your city? I also coded how these, the websites that published these videos, and what were the different communities that we can glean from the types of websites that published them, what communities can we glean showed up for this. And I found that the identity-specific websites, the blogs, the magazines that focused on queer people and women and Black people and South Asian people, all of whom were really authentically represented in this show, those were where most people showed up, right? So here I am showing how community found this work, right? Both in space and online. And you can see and access these reports if you go to weare.tv/research. I also interview our community and our artists about what they think about OTV, and those reports are also published on the website, which I think are really important. And finally, before I conclude, I think I've run a little long, I want to talk about future needs and struggles for this process. Of course, all of you are probably aware that all of these artifacts take money to preserve, right? So funding is critical in archival practice, right? And funding really brings us to the importance of institutions in archiving, and I'll get to that last sentence in a moment. Of course, for archiving in servers in multiple places, that takes a range of different kinds of resources, from physical hard drives, of which I have so many. They're so expensive to buy, and they have to be continually attended to because they do fail. The cloud has become an essential part of our practice because we're generating, more and more data. And even though you can get physical hard drives over 1 terabyte, we're starting to reach the place where you can't host our archive on one single hard drive. And so we host a lot of these artifacts on Dropbox, on Google Drive. Northwestern has its own kind of Dropbox called Box, which is nice because while Google Drive and Dropbox charge me for how much data I use, Northwestern thankfully does not charge professors for how much data they use. But that takes time, right? So there's even like staff labor that is required because I'm too busy to upload every single thing to Northwestern Box. I need undergraduate and graduate research assistants for that. Of course, you might note that a number of these companies are private corporations or publicly traded corporations. And many scholars, from Sophia Noble to Bob McChesney to Mark Andrejevic in Europe, have called for what Andrejevic calls public infrastructure for the digital landscape, or digital public infrastructure. We should have government-funded servers for archiving our communal artifacts, right? Our communal digital artifacts. Of course, also we have nonprofits like universities that do that as well, like Northwestern. And Vimeo, right, as I mentioned, is a form of this digital archive. Ultimately, digital preservation is a craft, an ongoing dialogue between the affordances of media, the intentions of creators and curators, and the institutional commitments and resources that enable preservation. I'm quoting there from, again, Trevor Owens, who is the Library of Congress digital preservation expert. Institutions are essential in this process, but the legacies of exclusion in these institutions present unique challenges. So I want to end on this anecdote where one of our artists came to me saying that they were starting to think about their legacy as an artist, because like I said, we've lost artists already in this process, even though they're super young. And they asked me, so what can OTV do for preserving my archives? And this was a multidisciplinary artist, so they had created video work for us, but they also had a lot of physical artifacts. They had like prints and paintings and photos and fashion. Brilliant artist, Kion Junio. And I told them, I told them everything I told you. And I also mentioned that I was, working with Northwestern to archive the video to make sure that it was preserved beyond our limited resources as a community-based organization. And they actually told me that that was a negative for them, that I was working with Northwestern, and that they actually wouldn't want their video at any large institution because of the ways in which large institutions have historically excluded for them non-binary Filipinx communities. I was really taken aback by that. I thought that would be a plus. I was saying, oh, it's great. Like, even if OTV ends up not existing because we're continually fundraising to exist, Northwestern's been here since the 1800s, so you can trust that it probably will be preserved there. And so I leave that to make sure that we humble ourselves and not think that we are saving communities, but rather that our communities really need robust forms of archiving, that this is a craft that is social. They want people from their communities to be the preservers of their legacy, and they are highly distrustful of large institutions. I think we, people like me, are intermediaries between these communities and institutions and can form that bridge, right? But we can't make it that only large institutions, large nonprofits and corporations are the holders of our stories. we also have to lift up the community-based organizations that are actively in community, in conversation, in constant dialogue, right? Going back to what Trevor Owen says about that dialogue, that ongoing dialogue with the people who have been impacted by systems of oppression. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Christian. That was fascinating and very relevant. There's many applause emojis in the Slack. I'm waiting to see if there's any questions, but if we could all clap for you, I know that we would. And I'm looking forward to downloading OTV on my Roku player.
Yes.
And watching all these beautiful shows. It's excellent. Everyone is very excited. And let's see, I'm waiting to see if anyone has any specific questions for you. And I would love to hear, Carolyn, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I think we would all love to hear about the work that you're starting to try to do with Northwestern libraries. And it also occurred to me when you were talking about that need for the community preserving their legacy. There's this saying in digital preservation that lots of copies keep stuff safe. So there may be an opportunity there to take advantage of the fact that, at least when it comes to the digital artifacts, we can sort of do both for safety. And maybe that's part of what, part of the way that you can talk about the Northwestern Libraries project. Just one more way to keep things safe.
I don't want to steal Dr. Christian's thunder. Thank you so much for your keynote. The only thing I'll say is that we're in conversation with Dr. Christian about a small set of OTV videos and acquiring that. And I think you just alluded to it. Updating those agreements with some of the artists was the first step, but there might be challenges there. So I appreciate the work you're trying to do. It seems like it is a balancing act for sure.
Yeah. And I will say that the biggest challenge in that, because we talked about this earlier this year and it's been a little stalled, that's mostly just been because of me, because I'm just too busy to I've had to rewrite the contract, and then I have to talk to all the individual artists. And like I said, I interview all the artists every year, but I put off those interviews until because our whole production cycle was delayed because of the pandemic. So we're actually releasing a lot of stuff right now, and I'm just in the process of doing those interviews. So it's going to be a process. It's going to take maybe a little longer than I thought it would. But it's really interesting, even just the labor of contracting as part of this process is something that I didn't quite think about, but it goes to, when you're living history, every moment seems so precious, but you only have so many hours in the day, right? And it's just not going to get done all at once.
We have a question. What are your thoughts about discovery? We catalog items we hold in our libraries and archives, but would it make sense to collaboratively catalog these kinds of collections that are managed by communities independent of libraries?
Wow, what a great question. I think about this often just because categorization is so essential to, I think, all digital forms of digital practice, even if you're not even thinking about it as an archive. When we tweet, we use hashtags, right, which is a form of categorization. And on our app, we want people to discover the shows, right? So we think about what are people going to search for on the app to find this content. And so we do it internally as a team, but I'm often made aware that we all think differently and we think about different things. And I would love to bring community into the process because I think that is super duper essential. There are ways in which there are forms of categorization that sometimes community will do just in the practice of doing things. So you post an Instagram post, someone comments, and they describe something in the post that is attracted to them. That becomes a keyword that we can draw from, right? But I also think about what would it mean for us to actually contract and work with our community to categorize all the things that we have, because they might be thinking about them in ways that we're not thinking about them. Yeah, yeah. There's actually more to say about that. Like, there's this artist I worked with who created this beautiful pilot for us called Conspiracy Theorist, which is about broadly a Black woman grad student who is contending with her own neurodivergence in academia, which is already kind of a mindfuck, right? Especially for Black women. Excuse my French. So, whenever we talk about her project, I'm always made aware that she thinks about it very differently than I do, and also she's always thinking about it differently. She's constantly doing like new cuts of it to like refine it, and so each cut might engender new forms of categorization, and it might be incumbent upon us when we have staff capacity to check in with artists about their projects over time and ask them, have your perspective on this project shifted? So yeah, that's just some thoughts I had to that question, not necessarily fully formed yet.
No, that's fascinating. That's a completely different way and a very interesting way to think about, like, yeah, archiving, live embodied archiving over time. Just checking the chat here. It's not any questions right now, but there is some discussion about the concern of social media as an archive, as a place where so many people store important work. And like you were talking about with the importance of the context of the comments and the other things that are brought to your personal Instagram. And maybe you would have those photos, but if Instagram went away, would you have the context, or how in the future would we be able to read the context of those materials? And
for how long will any of those companies keep things up, right? I mean, are we going to be in 2050 still being able to access posts from 2010? Like, there is a physical barrier to the amount of server space these companies require. And there's also ecological implications to that server space, right? And as we think about climate change, I can imagine a future, I almost hope to imagine a future in which our government says, you might need to limit server space because of its ecological imprint and the amount of energy required to keep them running and the amount of physical space and land that is required to take up all this stuff. So yeah, I definitely don't trust social media. And even outside of corporate influence, web series that are in my book that aren't that old, that are maybe only 10 years old, have already disappeared from YouTube. And I've been trying to fundraise for an archive of independent television from the early 20th century. There are very popular shows like, Broad City, which is a hugely popular show on Comedy Central. There's a season of that web series before they created it, which is a really fascinating artifact of how did they make that show on their own without corporate influence, and how did that shift when they got their big deal. One of those seasons is gone. I was teaching it in my classes and it's gone. I don't know why. Maybe it was a rights issue. Oftentimes it's a rights issue. They use something they don't have the rights to. Sometimes it's an interpersonal issue with like people who made it. There's differing conflict around who owns it, or, whatever it may be. Sometimes artists are just ashamed of their earlier work and they take it down. They're just like, I don't want anyone to see this. This is when I didn't have money, and now I have more money and my work is better now, right? But for me, I'm like, tens of thousands, sometimes millions of people watched your shitty work, right? And like, that actually matters to history. Like some historian is going to want to know, how were people making TV for like no money in this early 20th century? Because that might not be possible in 50 years for whatever reason.
That's a great point. We have a popular question here. Can you expand on the concerns that you've heard about archiving with institutions? I'd love to hear more about these critiques so that we can learn.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of fear from artists is what I'm hearing. I think there's a lot of fear about how the materials will be used, who will be using them, how will they be framed within institutions, right? A lot of the artists that I work with, I think because they hold identities that are difficult to categorize, and the whole theory of intersectionality really is about defying categorization itself. There's a wonderful article on intersectional methods from Lisa Boleg, which is much cited, and it's called When Black plus Woman plus Lesbian Does Not Equal Black Lesbian Woman. Basically says that like the ways in which we segment identities is completely incommensurable with intersectional identity. And she's thinking about quantitative methodology. And I think artists think about like, am I going to be put in the queer archive at Northwestern or the Filipino archive at Northwestern, right? And what would it mean for me as a queer Filipino to be in these two separate archives? I think that's just one concern. I think about the fact that many of our communities have been studied by universities specifically. And there's this whole experience they have with researchers where we come in, we collect our data, they relay their stories of trauma and harm or whatever. That goes into our journal articles and our books that become inaccessible to them, either inaccessible because like journal articles require like a university subscription, a library subscription, or books are just written for academics and just they can't understand how their stories are being translated to like scholars. So I think I come across this when it's like people's skepticism of universities. Specifically, I think there's probably other institutions where they have other concerns that I can't speak to because I only work in the university institutional context. Yeah.
Well, I think we will all be very anxious to hear if there's ways that Northwestern finds to make that easier, either with the contract or with sort of helping artists guide how their work is talked about or categorized. So that's a great point.
Yeah, you should invite me back to do this in like 5 to 10 years, and I'll have probably better data on how do we negotiate these situations.
Very cool. Waiting to see. It looks like there are a few people typing, but a lot of conversation about ways that Samvera institutions want to be thinking about this and are already thinking about this and how to fix and build trusts and with those sorts of relationships with communities.
I think it really is about that. I mean, that really is the thing. It's about the relationships. It's about the continuing to come back. It's about asking questions, listening, trying to integrate that as much as you can to your practice, coming back with something, asking more questions, getting that feedback. It's really trust building, right? And so I know that's really hard in institutions because you have other things to do besides building community, right? You have other jobs. And so maybe it's also about, the staff capacity within these institutions to like have staff specifically to check in with people who are in archives, whose information is being stored. Because just my general, as someone who comes into my community with my own privileges and is perceived as a person of privilege within my own community, I have found that when I've had conflicts with the people that I work with, it's about kind of just saying, okay, I hear your concerns, I'm listening, and I'm here for you whenever you want to hold me accountable, whenever you want to tell me more, not being defensive, right? Not making it seem like I'm resistant to critique, and being transparent about my own limitations, which is something I've learned about. Like, transparency is so key. And sometimes just letting people know, this is the institutional context that I find myself in. These are my institutional constraints. Mm-hmm. Letting them know that can actually be really informative, because then the things you're saying are not about you and they understand where it's coming from. And I've come into that issue, not as it relates to archiving, but just in terms of the practice itself. I realized that some of the conflicts I've had, I was just not being transparent because I thought artists didn't want to hear it, or I had to be vulnerable and talk about resources I didn't have. And I didn't want to let them know my own limitations because I felt almost ashamed to not be able to support them in the ways that I wanted to. And that's just not conducive to trust building.
That's a great point. Thank you so much. I'll give it another minute in case there's another question. A lot of notes on what a great keynote